Hey, this is Brian Jones from Valhalla Academy in Frankfort, Kentucky, and I'm here with Barry Fizer. Barry is a Renaissance man. He's a judoka. He's an amateur blacksmith, which is where I met him. We did a blacksmithing class, and so we're going to do a little interview because the whole time we did the class, he kept making references to the martial arts and how blacksmithing and martial arts had so much in common. The analogies, process, and so I thought that was actually really fascinating, and so I wanted to do an interview. So we're here in Winchester, Kentucky at Bluegrass Budokai, and we're just gonna chat about this and get his thoughts on this. So thanks for coming out, Barry.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm glad that somebody found my babbling interesting.
So what I want to first ask is blacksmithing and martial arts. Okay, a lot of our viewers are grapplers, but so you can talk about whatever martial arts you want. But grappling and martial arts, grappling and blacksmithing, what do those two things have in common? What are the similarities?
Well, mostly in grappling, it's going to be the precision of the moves. If you do a move just a little bit wrong, that's the difference between doing an arm bar and just holding somebody's hand. It can be 1 inch of difference in precision in how you move it. Obviously, you're not going to be grappling with a piece of white hot iron, so at least have tongs or something so that you're going to be doing that. But mostly, it's about precision. It's about body motion. I mean, one of the things that I've always felt is that anything that you do that allows you to move and interact with other people is a martial art. Ballroom dancing is a martial art. I mean, if you get into the lifts and stuff. But really, we're talking about what do you do with blacksmithing. And blacksmithing is precision, and it's knowing, well, to be cliche, it's knowing where to apply the force and how much force to apply.
Well, that makes perfect sense to me. Let's I guess what's interesting too is a friend of mine, I'm going to give a shout out to Ryan Foster, who's actually opened a martial arts school, and I don't know, called Serendipity, but it's just about the time that I took this class, and he's actually calling his school the Forge. And there's an anvil, and that's kind of his symbol. So let's take like 3, I guess, iconic symbols of blacksmithing. The
hammer, anvil, and tongs.
And even the forge too. Let's talk about the forge. So hammer, anvil,
it's hard
tongs.
to draw a symbolic forge. You can do the hammer and the anvil.
That's true, but I guess in a sense, okay, you've got some the heat, the distress of the heat. You're applying the heat. You've got this big heavy thing that you use to hit stuff against, and you got something that you hit stuff with, and you've got something to hold it. I mean, if we were to break down each of those pieces, what would you say that their relationship to the martial arts would be? Whether student, instructor, I don't know.
Well, I mean, if you're just thinking of symbolism, then obviously, if I put a hammer up, people would think, you're a carpenter or something. And the same thing with tongs, just a big pair of pliers. The anvil obviously is going to be the symbol that everybody thinks of, and because of cartoons and everything, it's going to be what's called the single-horned anvil. Mm-hmm. And that's going to really be the symbol of everything. And I gave some thought to it after you and I had discussed it at one point as to why an anvil would be a good symbol. And the thing that I thought was really interesting was the duality that goes in martial arts. The difference between how much force you do, but if you do it right, you don't really apply much force, especially like in grappling arts. And you let your opponent do most of the work. And so there's this duality of effort that you have in martial arts. Now, obviously, most martial arts around here, they use the taijutsu, the yin-yang symbol, as their symbol. But if you really dig into what that is a spiritual duality, not a physical duality. You look at an anvil, and mostly what you think of is applied force. I'm going to beat you into shape. But as you learned from making that leap, it's not a matter of how hard you hit, it's how well you hit. And sometimes you can just do it lightly. And so you've got this duality of meaning between people symbolizing the anvil as being a big, heavy, something that you put a lot of force into, but something that you can actually apply light amounts of force with. and generate those little leaves. I don't suppose you brought your little leaf.
I didn't bring it actually, but I'll put a little clip in there, a picture of what I made during this class. I'm pretty proud of it considering it's my first effort, but
yeah, it turned out pretty good. And the thing about the duality though is that there's a duality of interpretation that people are going to have. If you don't know anything about blacksmithing and you had a martial arts studio that was called The Forge, my first thought was, they're going to beat me until I'm into shape. But in reality, if you overbeat a piece of steel, if you overbeat a piece of any kind of metal, it work hardens and it breaks. Found out about that, didn't we? And so you've got to, the first meaning on a forge would be, okay, yeah, that'll rope in the people who are really into the hard work aspect. But the people who want to do the artistry of it, the meaning of a forge would be that we can expose you to a lot of work, but we're not going to work you to the point you break. It takes precision to make art out of steel, I think is a thought that would sum that up.
That's a really good point. And during this class that Barry was teaching, he was throwing things out there off the cuff that I thought were, thinking about them at the time, I was like, that makes perfect sense. And then a little bit later, I'm like, that could be worked into something really profound. But as a teacher, I'm just going to put my thoughts out there a little bit. I know I'm interviewing him, but he can comment on this as well. You take a piece of what is essentially scrap that's worthless, right?
Yeah, pretty much. What we were making stuff out of was scrap metal. Some of it I just pulled off the side of the road. Some of it was, found in a scrap pile somewhere. Yeah.
So you take this worthless piece of scrap and you apply stress to it through the heat. You make it malleable in a sense, and then you form it as an analogy for being an instructor. You've got a student who you see potential in. You take this, you apply the stress, you form it. You can't push them too hard without breaking them. So you got to push them hard enough, or they actually won't make any progress. So you see that being a good.
That is a good analogy. And one other analogy that goes with it is that every martial art that I've studied is composed of just a small handful of techniques. And if you get those techniques right, you can do amazing things. Blacksmithing, there are, depending on how you count them, and this one could be part of that one, but there are about 7 basic techniques that you can use. And if you can draw, which includes tapering, if you can upset, if you can twist, if you can, there's about 3 or 4 of them that if you can do those, you can make just about anything you want. Being able to do the fancy techniques, forge welding, in Aikido, that would be the 20-year throw, Yeah, that's cool to be able to do, but you don't really have to be able to do that to do on the street. So the analogy that I'm making there is that most every art has got a small number of things that you do. If you do those well, you can do the big things and accomplish anything you want.
So it's a focus on fundamentals, basics. I hate that word basics because that implies, simplicity, or implies simplistic. There's a difference between simple and simplistic. So the fundamentals, the base of the pyramid.
Well, the way that you can look at it is one of the simplest games in the world is Go. It has 2 rules, and it is one of the hardest games to play well. I used to play pretty good chess. I can't play Go. I am not good at that at all. I just don't think that way. And, or you think of any card game. The good card games have just got a few simple rules, and all of the complexity comes out of that.
That's really. And I think the analogies we could just sit here and pile them on. Something else I want to talk about is sort of a Eastern-Western maybe dichotomy. Everybody, when people think of blacksmithing, they always think of the Japanese swordsmiths and everything. Every culture throughout time has had swords. Okay, since people decided that they were going to sharpen a stick, the next thing was they were going to sharpen some metal, and so every civilization has had swords. But there's some mystique about the Japanese swordsmanship. Do you care to speak to that? The technique difference, maybe East versus West.
You mean in terms of how to use them or how to make them?
Well, I guess we'll talk about how to make them. I mean, the technique that goes behind it, because I guess what I've heard, in terms of the Japanese swordsmanship is they're the most superior swords and they're the best swords and they're everything. It just there's nothing in the West that compares to anything like that.
This comes down to it's more of an artistic aesthetic than it is anything else. The metallurgy that goes into making a traditional Japanese sword is the same metallurgy that went into making claymores about 600 years ago. It's an amazing piece of metallurgy, considering they didn't know what they were doing. It was truly experimentation, and this batch of iron sand works perfectly. And if I throw this much coal into it after letting it puddle for 3 days, then I end up with metal that's just right. That being said, and just as another thing, we weren't able to consistently match that metallurgy until probably the 1930s. Now we can consistently match that and exceed it. We've been doing this for a long time, and we've had, a few little things like Korea and Vietnam and all these things that spur military development which need metals. So our metallurgy has gotten so much better. In the traditional style, the Japanese sword making, there's all sorts of little variations that everybody does, but there's not that much difference between Eastern and Western sword styles, whether it's a claymore or whether it's a katana. There is a folding so that there's a first step where you puddle the iron and purify it, and then you start adding things back into it, but they didn't really have total control over it, and then they would do a few things that this guy discovered, and then his student discovered, and his student discovered, and finally they came up with a recipe that they could follow that would consistently mostly give them good swords. The problem was they didn't know what they were doing. The analogy that I like to use is that to make a good sword, you need to know the alloy, which is the mixture of iron with other agents that are in it. And what we do today is, at the iron mine, they pull the stuff out, they smelt it, they get the major impurities out of it, and then they do either a Bessemer process or they'll do some other things on it, and they'll end up with pure iron. And then they will add this much of this, and that much of that, and that much of that, and come up with exactly the recipe they want. The cooking analogy I like to use is, if I'm going to bake a loaf of bread, and here I've got a bag of whatever grains happen to be growing around, and I grind them up and make flour out of it. And over here I've got a bag of nice Durham wheat and a couple of bags of a few other things. Which one of these things is going to make a more consistent loaf of bread? Well, obviously this guy. You know what's in it. And if I want the extra flavors of millet and corn and stuff that came up in this, I'll take a bag of millet. Take a bag of corn and I'll mix it up, and I know exactly what I'm doing. The Japanese sword makers today, many of the traditional style sword makers, based on movies that I've seen, not movies, I should say documentaries, that I've seen, are using traditional techniques. They are baking a sword with the first bag of flour. They've got stuff, it works, it comes out well, but it's more because they've learned how to work with that particular bag of impurities, not through any inherent sense. And the amazing thing is that the people that I've seen interviewed, many of them have like chemical engineering degrees and such. They know what they're doing, but they fall back onto this traditional method because that's the way they do it. And that takes us into what are they gaining instead of going to a foundry and saying, I want a piece of this metal with these alloying agents and I want it in bar form so that I can do removed metal kind of thing. What are they adding by doing all of that? They are worshiping the soul of the sword. And it comes down to a thing that I've noticed in Eastern and Western cultures. Whether you're religious or not, most of us Westerners were exposed to Christianity. We're a monotheistic culture. We believe in a God above us, and we're kind of down here. Most of the Eastern cultures are based on an animistic type of thing, where you have Shen that is spreading through the universe, and everything has its own little piece of a soul or a spirit in it. And so by doing the extra effort of working the sword the way that they're working it, they are giving it more of a spirit. And that is improving the metal, even though the metallurgy may not be the ideal.
So you're saying there's essentially, in a way, they're trading physics for metaphysics.
Exactly. That is a very good summation. And if anybody who's done any martial arts for any length of time knows that your confidence honestly means a lot more than your actual technique in a lot of cases. Do I know I can get out of this? The second that I go, oh man, I'm beaten.
Mindset.
Yeah, I'm beaten. I'm down. I mean, I'm going to lose. The second that I start thinking I'm beaten. And if I've got a sword that has been imbued with the spirit of all of the previous sword makers in the world, I have this. Now, whether that, I'm not going to argue religion or metaphysics, whether that sword has that or whether I take confidence in knowing that sword has that and that gives me the extra ability, placebo effect as we would call it in Western society, that's great. I personally don't believe in a spirit in a sword. I think it's a stick with an edge. It's a metal stick with an edge. And a friend of mine summed it up perfectly. He started doing some research into the physics of swords about 10 years ago. And he said, you know, it's funny, you can take some guy who's got a doctorate in metallurgy and you put a sharpened stick in his hand and 50 IQ points drop off right then and there. So,
yeah, it goes back to that that mammalian brain, you know, it's like, stick.
I have stick, I am tough. Conan.
Well, we're about out of time, but I want to thank Barry for being interviewed today.
Sure.
He's had a lot to say. Maybe we'll have him back on here and we get some more stuff. He's got a lot more than this, believe me, I know. But we've only got a certain amount of time, so again, thanks. This is Brian Jones from Valhalla Academy in Frankfort, Kentucky, here with Barry Fizer, and we'll see you next time.